Jasmine Parker's fingers moved delicately over the silver wire, shaping it into intricate patterns that would soon become an elegant pendant. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows of her small jewelry workshop, casting dancing shadows across her workbench. At 49, she had found peace in this quiet mountain town of Cedar Springs, far from the digital chaos that had once consumed her life. The workshop itself reflected her personality, organized but not sterile, creative but grounded in technical precision. Hand-forged tools hung from pegboard walls alongside sketches of circuit board patterns that she'd unconsciously incorporated into her jewelry designs. Most customers assumed the geometric motifs were abstract art. They never suspected they were looking at the artistic interpretation of network architectures and data flow diagrams. The bell above her shop door chimed softly as Mrs. Henderson entered, her weekly visit as predictable as clockwork. At 73, Elizabeth Henderson had become something of a mother figure to Jasmine, one of the few people in town who seemed to sense that the quiet jewelry maker carried stories she rarely shared. "Good afternoon, dear," the elderly woman called out, her voice carrying the warmth that small-town residents shared, like a secret handshake. "How's that anniversary necklace coming along?" Jasmine looked up from her work, tucking a strand of graying brown hair behind her ear. The years had been kind to her face, adding laugh lines around her dark eyes and a wisdom that came from hard-earned experience. "Almost finished, Mrs. Henderson. Your husband will be impressed." She held up the delicate piece, a heart-shaped pendant with tiny emeralds arranged in a pattern that caught the light perfectly. To the casual observer, it was simply beautiful jewelry. To someone with Jasmine's background, the arrangement of stones followed the logical flow of a well-structured algorithm, beauty emerging from mathematical precision. "Oh, it's perfect!" Mrs. Henderson clasped her hands together. "You have such a gift, Jasmine. I can't believe you only started making jewelry 10 years ago. You work like someone who's been doing this her whole life." Jasmine smiled politely, but something flickered in her dark eyes, a shadow of memory that she'd learned to keep carefully controlled. Sometimes we discover talents we didn't know we had. It wasn't entirely a lie. She had discovered she could create beautiful things with her hands, could find satisfaction in work that brought joy rather than just efficiency. But Mrs. Henderson didn't need to know about the life Jasmine had left behind, the life where she'd written code that controlled hospital life support systems, air traffic control networks, and emergency response databases, where her programs had literally held lives in their digital hands. The transition from software architect to jewelry artisan hadn't been as strange as people might think. Both required patience, precision, and an understanding that small details could have profound consequences. Both demanded a craftsperson's attention to the relationship between form and function. The difference was that when jewelry broke, it was merely disappointing. When critical systems software failed, people died. After Mrs. Henderson left with her carefully wrapped necklace, Jasmine returned to her workbench. Her current project was a complex bracelet design inspired by circuit board patterns, though she doubted anyone would notice the subtle technological influence in the flowing silver lines. The piece represented months of work, each link individually forged and fitted with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that had once made her one of the most sought-after programmers in the critical systems field. Her workshop occupied the ground floor of a converted Victorian house on the edge of Cedar Springs' modest downtown district. The building had character, original hardwood floors, tall windows that provided excellent natural light, and enough space for both her jewelry work and the small apartment upstairs where she lived with Spartan simplicity. The irony wasn't lost on her. For 15 years, she'd been one of the best critical systems software developers in the country. She'd written code that kept planes in the sky, kept hospitals running, kept emergency services connected. Her programming had literally saved lives, protecting thousands of people from the kinds of catastrophic system failures that made headlines. Until the day it didn't. The memory still haunted her quiet moments, surfacing during the meditative repetition of jewelry work when her conscious mind relaxed its guard. St. Mary's Hospital in Portland, their entire network had crashed during a busy night shift. Life support systems, medication dispensers, patient monitors, everything had gone dark for nearly 6 minutes. 6 minutes that had felt like 6 hours for the medical staff trying to keep critical patients alive with manual procedures and backup equipment. She remembered the phone call at 3:17 a.m., doctor. Susan Chen's voice tight with controlled panic. Jasmine, we need you here immediately. The entire system is down, and we can't figure out why. She'd thrown on clothes and driven through empty Portland streets, arriving at the hospital to find chaos barely contained by professional training. The emergency generators had kept basic power running, but every computer system in the facility was locked in a boot loop, trying to restart but failing every time. Nurses were manually monitoring patients. Doctors were writing prescriptions by hand, and the emergency room was operating like a field hospital from the 1940s. It had taken her 4 hours to trace the problem back to its source, a single logic error in a routine update she'd written the previous week. A variable declaration that seemed harmless had interacted with the hospital's custom network protocols in a way that created a cascade failure, bringing down every connected system simultaneously. The investigation later showed it was her code, but also revealed multiple systemic failures that had turned a minor error into a catastrophic breakdown. The hospital's backup protocols had failed independently. Their redundant systems weren't actually redundant, and their testing procedures had missed the specific combination of circumstances that triggered the crash. 3 patients had suffered serious complications during those 6 minutes. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, a 74-year-old grandmother recovering from heart surgery, had gone into cardiac arrest when her monitoring system failed to alert nurses to dangerous rhythm changes. The delay in response had caused permanent damage. Mr. James Wright, a diabetic in the ICU, had suffered a hypoglycemic episode that wasn't caught because his glucose monitoring system was offline. Most devastating of all, 8-year-old Timothy Chen had experienced respiratory failure during the blackout, and the delay in detecting his crisis had contributed to complications that claimed his life 3 days later. Jasmine had been cleared of any legal responsibility. The investigation concluded that the error was genuinely unintentional, and that the hospital's backup systems should have prevented the cascade failure. Multiple parties shared responsibility, including the hospital's IT department, their system vendors, and regulatory agencies that had approved inadequate safety protocols. But legal clearance hadn't eased the weight in her chest every morning when she woke up, or the way she flinched whenever she heard ambulance sirens. The rational part of her mind understood that complex systems failed for complex reasons, that no single person could be held responsible for such a multifaceted breakdown. The emotional part of her mind carried the image of Timothy Chen's parents in the hospital waiting room, holding each other while grief transformed them into strangers to their former selves. She'd quit her job the next week, liquidated her savings, and driven until she found Cedar Springs, a town so small it didn't even have a traffic light, let alone complex computer systems that could fail catastrophically. The transition had been jarring at first. After years of working with cutting-edge technology, she'd found herself learning to shape metal with hammers and files, to set stones with techniques that hadn't changed much in centuries. But there was healing in the work. Each piece of jewelry she created was tangible, permanent, designed to last for generations. When she made a mistake, she could file it away, resolder a joint, or start over entirely. No one died when she misaligned a setting or chose the wrong gauge of wire. The worst consequence of failure was disappointment, not tragedy. A sharp knock on her door interrupted her memories. Jasmine looked up to see Tom Richards, the town mayor, peering through the glass with an expression that mixed excitement with barely contained panic. Behind him stood Sarah Mills, the town clerk, and Dr. Patricia Martinez, the superintendent of schools. The impromptu delegation suggested something more serious than a casual visit. "Jasmine, thank goodness you're here," Tom said as she opened the door. "We need your help with something urgent." At 62, Tom was the kind of man who wore his authority lightly. He'd run the local hardware store for 30 years before becoming mayor, and he still had the practical, no-nonsense attitude of someone who solved problems with his hands rather than committees. But today, his usual calm demeanor showed cracks of genuine stress. "What's wrong?" Jasmine asked, though she suspected she already knew. For the past 3 months, Tom had been pestering her to help with the town's new computer system, a grants-funded upgrade to their municipal services that was proving more complicated than anyone had anticipated. "It's the computer system," Tom confirmed, glancing nervously at his companions. "We've got the state inspector coming next week for our annual compliance review, and nothing is working properly. The contractor we hired, well, let's just say his expertise was greatly exaggerated." Sarah stepped forward, her expression mixing frustration with desperation. "Jasmine, I know you've said you don't work with computers anymore, but we're really desperate here. Tax records, business licenses, property deeds, everything is locked up in a system we can't access." Dr. Martinez nodded grimly. "The school district's network is connected to the same system. Student records, grade databases, attendance tracking. We can't function without it. And if we can't demonstrate compliance with state requirements by next week, we could lose our accreditation." Jasmine sighed, recognizing the trap closing around her. She'd been avoiding this conversation for months, deflecting Tom's increasingly desperate requests with gentle excuses and suggestions to find professional help elsewhere. But the panic in their eyes was hard to ignore, and these people had welcomed her into their community without questions or judgment. "Tom, I've told you before, I don't work with computers anymore. I make jewelry now. That's all." I know," Tom said quickly, his words tumbling over each other. "But Jasmine, you used to work with computers before you came here, right? Mrs. Patterson at the library said you helped her grandson fix his laptop last year, and Billy said you knew more about programming than his computer science teacher." That had been a mistake. A moment of weakness when she'd seen 14-year-old Billy Patterson struggling with a basic software installation. She'd helped him for 30 seconds, walking him through the process of updating device drivers. But apparently 30 seconds of competence had been enough to mark her as the town's unofficial tech support, a reputation that had been growing despite her efforts to discourage it. "Basic troubleshooting is very different from enterprise system administration," Jasmine said carefully. "What you're describing sounds like it needs professional IT consultants, not someone who fixes computers as a hobby." "Please," Tom interrupted, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him more closely. "Just take a look. 5 minutes. If you can't help, I'll find someone else. But we're desperate, and you're the smartest person in town. Everyone knows it, even if you pretend otherwise." Jasmine studied his face, seeing genuine distress beneath his usually calm demeanor. Cedar Springs had given her 10 years of peace, 10 years of quiet mornings and satisfied customers, 10 years of slow healing from wounds that had once seemed permanent. The least she could do was spend 5 minutes looking at their computers. "Fine," she said, reaching for her jacket. 5 minutes. But I'm not promising anything beyond basic diagnostics." Tom's relief was visible as they walked the 3 blocks to the town hall, a modest brick building that housed all of Cedar Springs' municipal operations. The structure had been built in the 1920s and renovated several times since, resulting in a charming, if slightly haphazard, mix of architectural styles. Modern additions sprawled behind the original facade, connected by corridors that seemed to have been planned by someone with only a loose understanding of building codes. As they approached, Jasmine could see the problem through the windows. People standing around looking frustrated, papers scattered across desks, and the glow of error messages on multiple computer screens. The scene was depressingly familiar, reminding her of countless emergency calls from her previous career. Inside, the situation was worse than she'd expected. The 5-person municipal staff was trying to manage everything manually, while their shiny new computers displayed various error messages and frozen screens. The contrast between the modern equipment and the chaos it had created was almost surreal. "The whole system just stopped working this morning," explained Sarah Mills, gesturing helplessly at her workstation. "We came in to find everything locked up. Can't access files, can't print documents, can't even get email. We've got tax records, business licenses, property deeds, everything locked up in there." Jasmine approached the nearest computer terminal, her trained eye immediately recognizing several problems. The system integration was poorly planned, the database connections were unstable, and the user interface looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never actually seen a municipal office operate. Error messages cascaded across multiple screens, each one indicating a different failure point in what should have been a coordinated system. "Who built this system?" she asked, already dreading the answer. "A company called Digital Solutions Plus," Tom replied, consulting a folder of documentation. "They won the bid by promising everything for half the cost of the other companies, said they specialized in rural municipal systems." Jasmine winced. In her experience, contractors who promised everything for half the cost usually delivered nothing for twice the price. She pulled up the error logs, her fingers moving across the keyboard with muscle memory she hadn't used in years. The familiar rhythm of diagnosis and analysis came back like a half-remembered song, comfortable and terrifying at the same time. The system architecture was a nightmare of shortcuts and poor decisions. Critical databases weren't properly backed up. Security protocols were either missing or incorrectly configured, and the entire network seemed to have been designed by someone who understood individual components but had no grasp of how they should work together. Within minutes, she'd identified the core problems. Database corruption caused by improper shutdown procedures, network configuration errors that prevented proper communication between servers, and security protocols that were blocking legitimate user access while leaving the system vulnerable to external threats. It was a mess, but it was a fixable mess, assuming someone with the right skills was willing to take on the liability. "How bad is it?" Tom asked nervously, watching her face for clues about their situation. Jasmine looked up from the screen, weighing her words carefully. She could see the hope in his eyes, the desperate faith that she might be their salvation. It was a look she remembered from her previous career, clients depending on her expertise to solve problems they didn't understand, trusting her with responsibilities that kept them awake at night. "It's not good," she said finally, "but it's not catastrophic either. Someone who knows what they're doing could have this working properly in a few days. The real question is whether the data is recoverable or if you'll need to rebuild everything from scratch." "Could you do it?" Dr. Martinez asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jasmine stared at the screen, feeling the old familiar pull of a complex problem waiting to be solved. Part of her, the part that had once thrived on impossible deadlines and critical systems, wanted to dive in immediately, to lose herself in the logical puzzle of broken code and corrupted databases. But the larger part of her remembered why she'd left that world behind, remembered the weight of responsibility that came with writing code that other people's lives depended on, remembered the crushing guilt when that code failed and people suffered the consequences. I don't do that kind of work anymore, Tom. I make jewelry. The disappointment in the room was palpable, but before anyone could respond, the building's lights flickered briefly and a low alarm tone sounded from somewhere in the back offices. "What was that?" Sarah asked, looking around nervously. As if summoned by the question, Mrs. Patterson from the library burst through the front door, her usually composed demeanor replaced by obvious distress. Behind her came Chief Davidson from the fire department, his radio crackling with urgent voices. "Oh, good, you're all here," Mrs. Patterson said breathlessly. "We have a much bigger problem. The library's computers are down too, and the school district system, and the hospital's scheduling network. And—" She paused to catch her breath. "Well, everything connected to the county network infrastructure." Tom's face went pale. "Everything?" Chief Davidson stepped forward, his expression grim. "The hospital called 20 minutes ago. Their appointment system is down. Their patient records are inaccessible, and they can't process insurance claims. The emergency room is operating on paper charts and manual procedures. The fire department's dispatch system is barely functional," he continued. "We're back to radio communication only, and if we get a major incident while the systems are down." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Dr. Martinez looked stricken. "If the school district can't demonstrate system compliance by next week, we lose state accreditation. That means no funding, no official recognition, no ability to issue transcripts or diplomas." Jasmine felt a familiar chill, the recognition that she was looking at something much more serious than poor installation work. System-wide failures across multiple networks suggested either massive incompetence or deliberate interference. In her experience, coincidences of this magnitude were usually neither coincidental nor accidental. "That's impossible," Tom said weakly. "These are all separate systems, managed by different contractors." "Are they?" Jasmine asked quietly, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Who provided the networking infrastructure for all these upgrades?" The answer was visible in Tom's expression before he spoke. "Digital Solutions Plus." They said they could save money by using shared network resources and standardized protocols. Jasmine closed her eyes, recognizing the scope of what had happened. Someone had convinced the entire county to put their digital infrastructure in the hands of a lowest bid contractor who had apparently connected everything to everything else with minimal security or backup protocols. It was exactly the kind of cascading system failure she'd spent years trying to prevent in her previous career, and exactly the kind of disaster she'd come to Cedar Springs to escape. Now it was happening in the place she'd chosen as her refuge from exactly this kind of crisis. The emergency meeting in the town hall conference room felt like a war council, if war councils were run by people who barely understood email. Tom had gathered the leaders of every organization affected by the system failures, and the collective panic was almost tangible. The room itself seemed to shrink under the weight of their shared crisis. Wood-paneled walls that had witnessed decades of routine municipal business now echoed with voices discussing catastrophic system failures and potential community collapse. Jasmine sat in the corner, officially just observing but increasingly aware that every eye in the room kept drifting toward her. She'd tried to maintain the fiction that she was simply a curious neighbor, but her technical questions during the initial assessment had revealed more expertise than any casual observer should possess. "All right, let's assess the damage systematically," Tom said, consulting a handwritten list that had grown throughout the afternoon as reports continued arriving. "Sarah, what's our situation at the municipal level?" Sarah Mills looked like she hadn't slept in days, though the crisis was only hours old. "Tax collection is completely offline. We can't process business licenses, building permits, or property transfers. The county recorder's office has the same problems. They can't access deed records or issue certified copies of any documents. And we have the state compliance audit next Tuesday. She rifled through a stack of papers that represented her attempts to recreate digital records manually. I've been trying to rebuild critical files from paper backups, but some records only exist in digital format. If we can't demonstrate proper record keeping and processing procedures, the state could revoke our municipal charter. The school district is in chaos, added Dr. Martinez, her professional composure cracking under the strain. No attendance records, no grade databases, no student scheduling. Parent-teacher conferences start Monday, and we can't tell parents how their children are performing because we can't access any academic records. Worse, we can't process payroll for staff, and teachers are already asking if they'll receive their paychecks on time. Fire Chief Davidson spoke up next, his weathered face grave with concern. Emergency dispatch is working, but barely. We're back to paper logs and radio communication only. Response times are increasing because we can't efficiently coordinate multiple units or access building plans and hazardous material information. If we get a major incident, a wildfire, a chemical spill, a multi-vehicle accident, we'll be operating blind. He pulled out a tablet that displayed a basic map with handwritten annotations. I've got my people manually plotting high-risk locations and updating paper charts, but it's 1980s technology trying to manage 2020's complexity. And if this continues much longer, mutual aid agreements with neighboring departments become meaningless because we can't coordinate effectively. But it was the hospital administrator, Janet Wells, whose report sent a chill through the room that seemed to drop the temperature by several degrees. We've had to postpone all non-emergency procedures, she said quietly, her voice carrying the controlled calm of someone delivering terrible news with professional composure. Our patient records are inaccessible, which means doctors can't review medical histories, medication lists, or allergy information. Prescription systems are down, so we're writing everything by hand and hoping pharmacists can read our handwriting. She paused, consulting notes written in the precise script of someone accustomed to life and death documentation. We can't process insurance claims, which means we're essentially providing free health care while our revenue stream has been cut off. Dr. Patterson is driving to other hospitals to borrow backup equipment. But if this continues past the weekend, we may have to start transferring patients to facilities that still have functional computer systems. The implications hung heavy in the air. Cedar Springs General wasn't a large hospital, but it served a rural area where the nearest alternative facility was 90 minutes away. In winter weather or during peak tourist season, those 90 minutes could mean the difference between life and death. Jasmine had been sitting quietly in the corner, officially just observing, but the mention of the hospital made her stomach clench with familiar dread. The memories of St. Mary's Hospital in Portland came flooding back. The cascade failure, the patient complications, the weight of knowing that her code had contributed to Timothy Chen's death. "What about the contractor?" asked Mrs. Patterson, her librarian's instincts focusing on the source of their problems. "This Digital Solutions Plus company that installed all these systems?" Tom's expression darkened, and he pulled out his phone with obvious frustration. "They're not answering calls. Their main office number goes to voicemail, their emergency support line has been disconnected, and their website is showing a temporarily unavailable message." He scrolled through his contacts, showing the evidence of hours spent trying to reach someone, anyone, who could explain what had happened. "I'm starting to suspect we've been defrauded. Sarah found some online reviews this afternoon. Apparently, Digital Solutions Plus has done this same kind of installation in at least 6 other rural counties over the past year, always with similar promises about cost savings and shared infrastructure." "And similar results?" Dr. Martinez asked grimly. "Unknown. The reviews either praise their initial sales presentation or complain about system failures, but nothing about long-term performance or support quality," Sarah leaned forward, her expression mixing anger with growing understanding. Tom, I've been thinking about the timeline. They collected 50% payment up front when they signed the contract, got another 30% when they finished the installation, and were supposed to receive the final 20% after a successful 90-day trial period. Which ends next week, Tom realized. Exactly. And if they've already collected 80% of their fee from us, and similar amounts from other counties, they could disappear with a substantial amount of money while leaving everyone else to deal with the aftermath. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They weren't just dealing with technical problems, they were potentially victims of a sophisticated fraud scheme that had left them with worthless computer systems and no recourse for recovery. So what do we do? Dr. Martinez asked, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd spent hours trying to manage crisis after crisis. We can't run a school district on paper indefinitely. Parents are already calling, asking if classes will continue as scheduled. We need to bring in outside experts, Tom said, though his tone suggested he already knew the challenges they faced. Real IT professionals who can assess the damage, recover whatever data is salvageable, and rebuild what needs rebuilding. How long will that take? Chief Davidson asked. Tom consulted notes he'd scribbled during frantic phone calls throughout the afternoon. I've talked to 3 different consulting firms in Portland. They're all saying the same thing. Weeks, maybe months for a complete fix, depending on how much data can be recovered and how extensively the systems need to be rebuilt. And the cost? Significantly more than our original project budget. We're looking at potentially 6 figures just for the assessment and recovery work, not including the cost of new equipment or software licensing. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Cedar Springs and the surrounding county couldn't operate for weeks without their computer systems. Schools would close, businesses would fail, people would suffer, and the community that had been slowly recovering from years of economic decline would face a crisis that could destroy decades of progress. Jasmine found herself studying the faces around the table. People she'd known for 10 years, neighbors who'd welcomed her into their community without questions or judgment. Tom, who'd never missed one of her jewelry shows and had personally recommended her work to friends in other towns. Sarah, who'd helped her navigate the maze of business licenses when she first opened her shop and had become a genuine friend over the years. Dr. Martinez, whose daughter had bought her first necklace from Jasmine for her graduation and who'd sent a handwritten thank you note. These weren't just abstract victims of a system failure. They were people she cared about, a community that had given her a second chance at life when she desperately needed one. They needed help, and despite her fears and reservations, she was probably the only person within 100 miles who could provide it. The weight of that realization settled on her shoulders like a familiar burden. She'd spent 10 years running from responsibility, from the possibility of making mistakes that could hurt people. But running away from responsibility didn't make the responsibility disappear. It just meant that someone else would bear the consequences of inaction. There might be another option, she said quietly. The room turned toward her with the kind of sudden attention that suggested drowning people spotting a life preserver. Hope and desperation mixed in their expressions, creating a pressure that felt almost physical. Jasmine, Tom said carefully, his voice carrying both gratitude and apprehension. Are you saying you could fix this? She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settling around her like chains. I'm saying I could try, but I need you all to understand something first, and I need you to understand it clearly. The room leaned forward, hanging on her words. I haven't done this kind of work in 10 years, she continued, choosing each word carefully. Technology changes fast, and while the fundamentals remain the same, The specific skills required for modern network administration may have evolved beyond my current expertise. I might not be as sharp as I used to be. But you could try, Janet pressed, her medical background making her comfortable with calculated risks and uncertain outcomes. Jasmine nodded slowly. I could try, but I have conditions, and they're non-negotiable. Name them, Tom said immediately, speaking for the room. First, this stays quiet. I don't want attention from outside the county. No press coverage, no public recognition, no social media posts about the local hero who saved the day. I value my privacy, and I have reasons for maintaining a low profile. She paused, looking around the room to make sure everyone understood the seriousness of the condition. Second, if I can't fix it quickly and safely, we call in the professional experts immediately. I'm not going to let pride or stubbornness prevent you from getting proper help if my approach isn't working. Her voice grew quieter, carrying a weight that suggested deeper significance. And third, if anything goes wrong, if I make things worse somehow, if my intervention causes additional problems or complications, that's on me. Not the town, not any of you. I take full responsibility for the consequences of my actions. The room was silent for a moment, digesting not just the conditions, but the implications of what she was saying. There was something in her tone that suggested this wasn't just about technical liability. There was a personal history behind the careful phrasing, a story that explained her decade of self-imposed exile from the technology world. Tom spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years making difficult decisions for his community. Jasmine, we trust you. Whatever your background, you've been part of this community for 10 years. We've watched you help your neighbors, contribute to local charities, and build a business that brings beauty and craftsmanship to our town. If you're willing to help, we're willing to let you try. Dr. Martinez nodded agreement. What do you need from us? Access to everything, Jasmine replied, her tone shifting to the practical focus of someone transitioning from reluctant volunteer to project manager. All the systems, all the passwords, all the documentation that still exists. I'll need a quiet place to work, somewhere I won't be interrupted or observed while I'm analyzing the problems. You can use the back office, Sarah offered immediately. It's got network access, multiple workstations, and no one goes back there except for storage. We can set up everything you need. How long do you think it will take? Chief Davidson asked, his emergency management background focusing on timeline and resource allocation. Jasmine was quiet for a long moment, mentally cataloging everything she'd observed about the system failures, weighing technical complexity against available time and resources. If it's just poor installation and configuration issues, maybe 48 hours to get basic functionality restored to all critical systems, she said finally. If there's been actual sabotage, if the data is extensively corrupted, or if the problems are more fundamental than they appear, it could take longer. And if the problems are worse than that, then we call the FBI and hope for the best. The meeting began to break up as people returned to their crisis management duties, but the atmosphere had changed. There was still anxiety and uncertainty, but also hope, the possibility that their disaster might be fixable, that their community might survive this crisis intact. As the room emptied, Tom lingered behind with Jasmine, his expression mixing gratitude with curiosity. "Can I ask you something?" he said when they were alone. "You can ask." "What did you really do before you came here? I mean, obviously you know computers, but this level of expertise doesn't come from fixing laptops for neighbors. The way you analyzed those systems, the questions you asked, the technical vocabulary you used, that's not hobbyist knowledge." Jasmine had been dreading this question for 10 years, but she'd also known it would come eventually. She could lie, deflect, or simply refuse to answer. But these people were trusting her with their livelihoods and their community's future based on nothing more than faith in her character. They deserved honesty, even if it was painful to provide. "I wrote software for critical systems," she said finally, the words feeling strange after years of careful avoidance. "Hospitals, airports, emergency services, power grids, the kind of programs that people's lives depend on every day without ever thinking about it. That sounds like important work, meaningful work. Why did you leave it?" The question hit harder than she'd expected, stirring up emotions she'd spent years learning to control. "Because I made a mistake once. A bad one. People got hurt because of code I wrote, and I decided that the world was safer with me making jewelry instead of writing programs that could fail when people needed them most." Tom studied her face with the shrewd eyes of someone who'd spent decades reading people, assessing their character and reliability. "But you're willing to risk making another mistake to help us?" "I'm willing to try," Jasmine replied, meeting his gaze directly. "Because sometimes the risk of doing nothing is worse than the risk of trying. And because this community gave me a home when I needed one, maybe it's time I repaid that debt." That evening, Jasmine sat in her workshop, staring at her half-finished jewelry projects. Tomorrow, she would return to a world she'd abandoned, using skills she'd deliberately let rust, taking responsibility for systems that could affect hundreds of people's lives. The familiar tools of her trade, hammers, files, soldering equipment, seemed to mock her with their simplicity and predictability. She opened a drawer in her workbench and pulled out a small, worn notebook, the only memento she'd kept from her programming days. The leather cover was cracked and faded, the pages yellowed with age and filled with handwritten code snippets, debugging techniques, and system architecture diagrams. At the back, written in faded ink, was a quote she'd copied from somewhere long ago. "The measure of a person is not the mistakes they make, but what they do when given the chance to make things right." She'd run from her mistakes for 10 years, building a new life based on avoiding the possibility of failure rather than embracing the responsibility of trying. Tomorrow she would finally stand and face the demons she'd been fleeing, armed with a decade of hard-earned wisdom and the knowledge that some things were worth the risk of failure. But first, she had a few phone calls to make to old contacts, people who might still remember Jasmine Parker, even if they thought she'd disappeared forever. The first number she dialed belonged to David Kim, a former colleague who'd specialized in network security. His voice sounded older when he answered, but the sharp intelligence was unchanged. "David, this is Jasmine Parker." There was a long pause. "Jasmine? Jesus, we all thought you were dead. You just vanished 10 years ago. Where have you been?" "Hiding," she said simply. "David, I need some advice on modern network security protocols. Off the record, completely confidential." Another pause, shorter this time, but weighted with understanding. "What kind of advice? And what kind of trouble are you in?" "The kind where a small town's entire digital infrastructure has failed simultaneously, and I'm trying to figure out if it's incompetence or sabotage." David's voice sharpened immediately. "Jasmine, are you working on a system that was installed by a company called Digital Solutions Plus?" The question hit like a physical blow. "Why do you ask?" "Because Digital Solutions Plus doesn't exist anymore. I mean, they existed for about 6 months, long enough to win several rural contracts across the Pacific Northwest, but the company was dissolved 3 weeks ago. The principals disappeared with about $2 million in advance payments from various municipalities." Jasmine felt the familiar chill that came with recognizing a much larger problem than initially apparent. "David, what exactly are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that someone ran a systematic con game on small counties and towns across Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. They promised cut-rate IT solutions, collected advance payments, installed deliberately vulnerable systems, and then vanished. Deliberately vulnerable how? That's the scary part. We've been tracking this for weeks at the request of the FBI's Cybercrime Division. The systems they installed aren't just poorly configured, they're designed to be compromised. Remote access backdoors, disabled security protocols, network architectures that prioritize access over protection. It's like someone built a highway system with no locks on any of the doors. Jasmine's mind raced through the implications, her programmer's instincts automatically analyzing the attack vector. You're saying our systems were deliberately sabotaged as part of a larger operation? I'm saying your systems are probably being monitored and controlled by someone with very sophisticated capabilities and resources. Jasmine, if you're working on one of these networks, you need to get out immediately, and you need to call the FBI. After David hung up, Jasmine sat staring at her computer screen with new understanding. The system failures weren't the result of incompetence. They were the opening move in something much more dangerous. She spent the next hour documenting everything she'd discovered, copying critical data to secure drives, and building a timeline of the systematic vulnerabilities she'd identified. Then she began the delicate process of probing the network's darker corners, looking for evidence of the intrusion David had warned her about. She found it in the hospital's patient database. Hidden in what appeared to be routine system logs were connection records showing external access to the most sensitive data the system contained. Someone had been inside the network for weeks, possibly months, copying files, mapping system vulnerabilities, and establishing the kind of persistent access that professional hackers used for long-term operations. The access patterns were sophisticated beyond anything she'd expected. Whoever was doing this wasn't just stealing data. They were preparing for something bigger. The reconnaissance was systematic, thorough, and followed methodologies that suggested either state-level resources or criminal organizations with substantial technical capabilities. Her secure phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Ms. Parker, we know you're investigating our work. Please stop, or the consequences will be severe. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the message again. Someone was watching her work in real time, monitoring her progress and responding to her discoveries within minutes. She looked around the small office, suddenly aware of every camera, every microphone, every possible surveillance device that could be observing her activities. Another message appeared. You have 30 minutes to stop what you're doing and leave the building. This is your only warning. Jasmine stared at the screen, feeling the familiar weight of a critical decision pressing down on her. She could walk away, call the FBI, and let federal agents handle whatever was happening. It was the safe choice, the smart choice, the course of action that any reasonable person would take when confronted with threats from sophisticated adversaries. Or she could spend the next 30 minutes doing as much damage as possible to whatever operation was threatening her community. She chose the third option. Instead of leaving or calling for help immediately, Jasmine began the most intensive hacking session of her career. Using skills she'd developed over 15 years of critical systems work, enhanced by a decade of enforced sabbatical that had given her perspective on the bigger picture, she began systematically mapping the intruder's network presence. What she found made her blood run cold. The attack on Cedar Springs was just one piece of a much larger operation. The intruders had similar access to dozens of small towns and counties across the region, all of them connected through the fraudulent Digital Solutions Plus installations. It was a coordinated campaign that had been years in the planning, targeting rural communities specifically because they lacked the resources and expertise to detect or resist sophisticated cyber attacks. According to the files she was uncovering, the main attack was scheduled to begin in 6 hours. The scope of it was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. Simultaneous disruption of emergency services, hospital systems, and municipal infrastructure across a three-state region. Traffic control systems would fail during evening rush hour, causing massive accidents and gridlock. Hospital life support would be compromised during shift changes, when staffing was minimal and response capabilities stretched thin. Emergency dispatch would go dark during peak incident hours, leaving first responders blind and uncoordinated. It was designed to cause maximum chaos and casualties, the kind of cyber attack that could cripple an entire region's infrastructure, while demonstrating the vulnerability of American rural communities to foreign interference. Jasmine's phone rang. When she answered, a calm voice with a slight accent spoke directly to her fears. "Ms. Parker, you've been busy. I'm impressed by your technical skills. Your reputation from your previous career was not exaggerated. Who is this?" "Someone who would prefer not to harm the good people of Cedar Springs. But you're forcing our hand by interfering with operations that are much larger than you understand." "What do you want?" "We want you to stop interfering with our demonstration. Pack up your equipment, go home, and spend the evening making jewelry. In return, we'll ensure that Cedar Springs is excluded from tonight's festivities." Jasmine felt ice forming in her stomach. Tonight's festivities? Let's call it a lesson in vulnerability. Your government has been slow to appreciate the fragility of rural American infrastructure. We're providing an educational experience that should motivate better investment in cybersecurity for small communities. The casual tone made the threat even more chilling. This wasn't personal vendetta or random criminal activity. It was calculated warfare designed to inflict maximum psychological impact, along with physical damage. "How many people are you planning to hurt?" "That depends entirely on you, Ms. Parker. Cooperate with us, and Cedar Springs will be spared the worst of what's coming. Continue interfering with our timeline, and we'll start our demonstration right here, right now, with your neighbors bearing the full consequences of your stubbornness." The line went dead. Jasmine stared at her computer screen, where the evidence of the coming attack scrolled past in endless technical detail. She had maybe 5 hours to prevent a catastrophe that could affect thousands of people across multiple states, but any action she took would put her own community at immediate risk. She also had something the attackers didn't expect: 15 years of experience in critical systems programming, a decade of pent-up guilt looking for redemption, and absolutely nothing left to lose except a community that had become her family. Time to find out if 10 years of making jewelry had dulled her edge or sharpened her focus on what really mattered. Jasmine's first priority was protecting Cedar Springs without triggering immediate retaliation. She began by carefully isolating the local systems from the wider network, cutting the connections that would allow the attackers to maintain control while making the changes appear to be routine maintenance rather than active resistance. It was delicate work that required her to think like both a defender and an attacker simultaneously. Too aggressive, and she might crash systems that were still providing essential services to people who needed them. Too cautious, and the attackers would have time to implement whatever they had planned before she could build adequate defenses. Her phone buzzed constantly with threats and warnings, each message more explicit than the last. But she'd turned off the notifications. Whatever was going to happen would happen in the next few hours, and distractions could be fatal. Not just to her efforts, but to the people depending on those efforts. The hospital system was her biggest concern. Life support equipment was connected to the network through what Digital Solutions Plus had called efficiency protocols, a system that allowed centralized monitoring of patient vital signs and automated adjustment of medication delivery systems. In reality, It was a backdoor that could be used to interfere with critical medical equipment in ways that would appear to be natural system failures. Jasmine wrote code faster than she had in years, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she built firewalls and isolation protocols from scratch. Every few minutes, she copied her work to secure drives, paranoid about losing progress to another system crash or targeted attack against her workstation. The code she was writing wasn't elegant or efficient. It was desperate, improvised protection designed to hold long enough for help to arrive or the immediate crisis to pass. Under normal circumstances, she would have spent weeks testing and refining these defensive measures. Tonight, she had to trust her instincts and hope that 15 years of experience could compensate for the lack of proper testing protocols. Around 6 p.m., Tom knocked on the office door with the careful politeness of someone trying not to interrupt something important. "Jasmine?" People are starting to worry. "Sarah said you've been in here for 8 hours without a break, and there are rumors that you're in some kind of trouble." She looked up from her screen, realizing she'd lost track of time completely. The outside world had faded away, replaced by the intense focus that came with working on critical systems under extreme pressure. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten anything. "Tom, I need you to do something for me urgently," she said, her voice carrying an authority that made him straighten instinctively. "Call the FBI field office in Portland. Ask for Agent Carmen Martinez in cybercrime. Tell her that Jasmine Parker needs to speak with her immediately about Operation Digital Storm." Tom frowned, recognizing that this was more serious than a simple computer repair job. "Operation Digital Storm? What is that?" "Just tell her that exact phrase. She'll know what it means, and she'll understand why it's urgent." "Are you in some kind of danger?" Jasmine considered the question while part of her attention remained focused on the code scrolling across her screen. "The whole region is in danger, Tom. I'm trying to prevent it from getting much worse, but I need federal resources that I can't access on my own." As Tom left to make the call, Jasmine returned to her work with renewed intensity. She'd managed to isolate most of Cedar Springs' critical systems, but she was also tracing the attackers' infrastructure, mapping their control networks and identifying the servers they were using to coordinate the operation. What she found was sophisticated beyond her worst fears. The attack was being coordinated from multiple locations around the world, using a combination of legitimate cloud servers, compromised government systems, and networks that had been built specifically for this operation. The technical complexity suggested nation-state resources, not common cybercriminals operating for financial gain. Her phone rang. Agent Carmen Martinez's voice was sharp with recognition and barely contained alarm. "Jasmine Parker, I thought you disappeared from the face of the earth forever." "Hello, Carmen. I need to report an imminent cyber attack on critical infrastructure. Multiple states, coordinated timing, civilian casualties likely." There was silence on the other end of the line as Carmen processed the implications. She'd been tracking cyber threats for the FBI for over a decade, and she knew the difference between paranoid speculation and credible intelligence from someone with the technical background to recognize genuine threats. "What's your source for this intelligence?" "I'm inside their network. I've been tracking their preparations for the past 6 hours, and I have documentation of their target lists, timing, and attack methodologies." "Jesus Christ, Jasmine. Are you telling me you've been conducting unauthorized penetration testing of a foreign intelligence operation?" "I'm telling you I stumbled into something while trying to fix a small town's computer system, and now I'm in too deep to back out safely without federal intervention." Carmen was quiet for a moment, weighing protocol against immediate necessity. "Send me everything you have, immediately. Use the secure transmission protocols we established during the Portland airport incident." "I remember the procedures." and then get out of there before someone decides you're too dangerous to leave alive. I can't leave yet, Carmen. I'm the only thing standing between these people and a catastrophic attack on civilian infrastructure. If I walk away now, people die. Jasmine, you're not a federal agent. You're a civilian who's gotten in over her head with hostile foreign intelligence operatives. I was never a federal agent, Carmen, but I was the best critical systems programmer you ever worked with, and right now that's exactly what this situation needs. After transmitting her files to Carmen through encrypted channels that brought back memories of more official collaborations, Jasmine turned her attention to the attacker's command structure. If she could identify their control servers and disrupt their coordination capabilities, she might be able to prevent the attack from proceeding on schedule. It was dangerous work that pushed the boundaries of what was legally permissible for a civilian to attempt. Every probe she sent into their network risked discovery, and discovery would likely mean immediate retaliation against Cedar Springs and everyone in it. But passive defense wouldn't be enough to stop what was coming. At 8 p.m., her analysis was interrupted by shouting from the main office. Jasmine looked up to see Tom running toward her office, his face pale with panic and something approaching terror. Jasmine, we've got a serious problem. The hospital just called. Their backup generators failed during a routine test, and the main power grid is showing unusual fluctuations. Dr. Patterson thinks someone is testing our electrical system. Jasmine felt her stomach drop as she realized what was happening. The attackers weren't waiting for their scheduled timeline. They were beginning preliminary strikes to test their access and her defenses, probing for weaknesses while applying pressure to force her into compliance. Tom, I need you to coordinate with Chief Davidson immediately. Get the fire department to dispatch teams to the hospital, the school, and the water treatment plant. If the power grid fails completely, we'll need manual backup systems for everything critical. What's happening? What kind of attack are we dealing with? Someone is attacking our infrastructure as part of a much larger operation. I don't know if I can stop them completely, but I'm going to try to minimize the damage and buy time for federal resources to respond. As Tom ran to coordinate emergency responses, Jasmine dove back into her work with desperate intensity. She had maybe an hour before the main attack began, and she was running out of defensive options. Every system she protected seemed to reveal two more vulnerabilities that the attackers could exploit. That's when she noticed something odd in the attackers' communication patterns. Their command structure was more centralized than she'd initially realized, with most operational instructions flowing through a single server cluster located somewhere in Eastern Europe. It was a vulnerability she could potentially exploit, but doing so would require her to transition from defensive operations to active cyber warfare. It was exactly the kind of aggressive response that was normally handled by military specialists and federal agents with proper authorization. It was also completely illegal for a civilian to conduct without explicit government permission. But as the lights flickered throughout the building and emergency sirens began wailing in the distance, Jasmine realized that legal niceties were a luxury they couldn't afford. She began preparing a logic bomb, a piece of malicious code designed to lie dormant until triggered, then systematically destroy the attacker's command and control infrastructure from within their own network. At 9:47 p.m., the main attack began with a coordinated assault that demonstrated the full scope of what they were facing. The first sign of the full-scale assault was the hospital's emergency broadcast system activating without authorization, sending a coded message across the county's emergency frequencies that overrode all other radio traffic. Jasmine recognized it immediately as a test of the attacker's control over critical communications infrastructure and a demonstration that they could prevent coordination between emergency responders when the real attack began. Within minutes, reports were flooding in from across the region through the few communication channels that remained operational. Traffic lights in Seattle had started displaying random patterns, causing massive gridlock during evening rush hour and at least 3 serious accidents. Portland's airport had lost contact with 4 incoming flights, forcing emergency landings at alternate airports. Emergency dispatch centers from Olympia to Sacramento were reporting complete system failures that left first responders operating blind. Jasmine worked with methodical desperation, her screens displaying cascading data from across the compromised network. The attackers' coordination was flawless. Each system failure was timed to maximize chaos and strain emergency response capabilities that were already overwhelmed by the simultaneous nature of the assault. Her phone rang. Carmen's voice was tight with professional tension and barely controlled fear. "Jasmine, we've got federal resources mobilizing, but it's going to take hours to coordinate a proper response. The scope of this attack is beyond anything we've prepared for. How much damage can they inflict in the meantime?" Jasmine glanced at the news feeds she had running on a secondary monitor, watching real-time reports stream in from across the Pacific Northwest. Early reports were already devastating. Multiple vehicle accidents caused by malfunctioning traffic signals, an elderly patient in critical condition after life support equipment experienced unexplained malfunctions, emergency services overwhelmed by simultaneous system failures across hundreds of locations. "Enough to kill people," she replied grimly, her fingers never stopping their desperate dance across the keyboard. "Carmen, I may have found a way to disrupt their command structure, but it requires me to do some things that are probably highly illegal under current federal statutes." "What kind of things?" "The kind that could be considered acts of cyber warfare against foreign assets operating on American soil." There was silence on the line as Carmen weighed federal law against immediate necessity, protocol against the reality of people dying, while proper authorization moved through bureaucratic channels that operated on completely different timelines than cyber warfare. "Jasmine, if you have the capability to stop this attack and federal resources aren't available yet, are you giving me authorization to proceed?" "I'm telling you that sometimes good people have to make hard choices without perfect authority. And I'm telling you that I trust your judgment based on 15 years of knowing your character and capabilities." That was all the permission Jasmine needed. She activated her logic bomb at 10:23 p.m., launching what amounted to a one-person cyber warfare operation against a sophisticated enemy network. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Across the digital battlefield, the attackers' command servers began experiencing cascading failures as Jasmine's malicious code spread through their infrastructure like a digital virus. Their coordinated assault devolved into chaos as individual attack cells lost contact with central command and began operating on pre-programmed instructions that were no longer relevant to the rapidly changing situation. But the attackers adapted faster than Jasmine had hoped. Within minutes, they'd identified her intrusion and begun tracing her location while implementing countermeasures to limit the damage she could inflict. Worse, they started redirecting their failing attack towards Cedar Springs specifically, concentrating their remaining resources on the small town that had dared to fight back. "They're coming for us directly now," Jasmine muttered, watching hostile code flood toward the local systems she'd spent hours protecting. Her defensive measures held, but she could see them weakening under the concentrated assault. The hospital was hit first. Emergency power systems began cycling on and off in patterns designed to create dangerous fluctuations in critical care equipment. Jasmine rerouted power management through backup protocols she'd installed, but it was a temporary solution that required constant manual adjustment to maintain stability. Next came the fire department. Their dispatch system crashed completely, displaying error messages that prevented them from receiving or coordinating emergency calls. Chief Davidson's voice crackled over the emergency frequency, requesting immediate assistance for multiple simultaneous incidents that his department couldn't properly coordinate or respond to. The school's heating system activated at maximum output despite the building being empty, creating a fire hazard that could spread to neighboring structures. Jasmine remotely shut down the system, but doing so revealed her exact location in the network to anyone monitoring the traffic patterns. Her phone buzzed with a new message. "Impressive work, Ms. Parker. But you can't protect everyone at once. Watch what happens when we stop playing games." As if to prove the point, every streetlight in Cedar Springs went out simultaneously, plunging the town into complete darkness. Emergency generators kicked in at critical facilities, but residential areas were left in blackout conditions that would complicate any emergency response efforts. Jasmine's fingers flew across the keyboard as she fought to maintain control of the systems that mattered most. It was like trying to plug dozens of leaks simultaneously, while the attackers opened new holes faster than she could close them. Each successful defense revealed two new vulnerabilities that required immediate attention. At 11:15 p.m., the attackers played their final card with ruthless precision. The message that appeared on her screen was simple and terrifying. "You have 30 seconds to surrender control of all systems, or we will. Demonstrate what happens when hospital life support equipment receives incorrect commands." The patient in ICU bed 3 is particularly vulnerable. Jasmine stared at the threat, her mind racing through possibilities, while her heart hammered with the knowledge that real people would suffer the consequences of her decision. She could surrender, hope that federal forces would arrive in time to prevent further damage, and accept that her community would become a demonstration of American vulnerability. She could continue fighting, knowing that people might die as a direct result of her resistance, but hoping that her efforts could prevent even greater casualties. Or she could attempt something that had never been tried in the history of cyber warfare, something so theoretically impossible that no defensive protocols existed to counter it. Instead of defending specific systems or attacking enemy networks, Jasmine began uploading herself into the infrastructure itself. Using every technique she'd learned in 15 years of critical systems programming, enhanced by insights gained from a decade of enforced reflection on the nature of complex systems, she began distributing her consciousness across the network itself. She uploaded copies of her decision-making algorithms, her pattern recognition systems, her debugging protocols, essentially creating dozens of digital versions of herself throughout the compromised infrastructure. It was theoretically impossible, practically insane, and absolutely necessary. Each distributed copy of her programming operated independently, making real-time decisions about system priorities and threat responses based on the accumulated wisdom of her entire career. When the attackers tried to crash the hospital's life support systems, her digital copies immediately rerouted power through backup channels and switched to redundant protocols she'd established. When they attempted to disable emergency dispatch, her distributed intelligence activated alternate communication channels and restored critical databases from hidden backups she'd created. The attackers found themselves fighting not one defender, but dozens of them, each responding with the accumulated expertise of her entire professional life, and guided by an intimate understanding of how critical systems actually functioned under stress. "What the hell are you doing?" Carmen's voice came through her phone, tight with alarm and professional fascination. "The network traffic from your location just increased by about 3,000%, and our monitoring systems are showing activity patterns we've never seen before." "I'm everywhere at once," Jasmine replied. Her attention split between 17 different system monitors, while her consciousness operated simultaneously across multiple network nodes. "They can't attack what they can't isolate, and they can't isolate something that exists in multiple places simultaneously." At 11:47 p.m., the tide of the digital battle began to turn decisively in favor of the defenders. The attackers' coordination broke down completely as they struggled to combat defenders who seemed to anticipate every move and counter every strategy with responses that adapted in real time to changing conditions. Their systematic assault devolved into desperate, random attacks that Jasmine's distributed systems countered with increasing effectiveness and confidence. One by one, critical services came back online throughout the region. Hospital systems stabilized and resumed normal operation. Emergency dispatch restored full functionality with enhanced security protocols. The power grid began operating normally for the first time in hours, with built-in safeguards that would prevent similar attacks in the future. By midnight, the attackers had given up their assault on the Pacific Northwest entirely and begun withdrawing from the compromised systems, deleting evidence and closing back doors as they retreated to regroup and plan for future operations elsewhere. Jasmine collapsed back in her chair, physically and mentally exhausted from the most intense programming session of her career. She'd been at her computer for nearly 20 hours straight, and the adrenaline crash was hitting her like a physical blow that left her hands shaking and her vision blurry. Her phone rang. Carmen's voice carried a mixture of awe, concern, and professional respect. "Jasmine, what you just accomplished, I've never seen anything like it in 15 years of cybersecurity work. Federal Cyber Command is calling it the most sophisticated defense of civilian infrastructure in recorded history. Did it work? Are people safe? Preliminary reports show minimal casualties despite system failures affecting millions of people across 3 states. Whatever you did, you saved lives. Probably thousands of them." Jasmine closed her eyes, feeling a weight she'd carried for 10 years finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. For the first time since Timothy Chen's death, she'd used her skills to protect people rather than inadvertently harm them. "Carmen, I need to ask you something important. The logic bomb I deployed, the network infiltration techniques I used, the unauthorized access to foreign systems. How much legal trouble am I facing?" "Officially? You probably violated about 15 different federal statutes related to unauthorized access of computer systems, cyber warfare operations, and interference with foreign intelligence activities." Jasmine's heart sank as she contemplated the possibility that saving her community might result in federal prosecution. "Unofficially," Carmen continued, "you prevented a foreign attack on American infrastructure using methods that probably saved more lives than any single action in the history of cyber warfare. I think we can work something out with the prosecutors, especially given the extraordinary circumstances and the fact that you were acting to protect civilian lives." 3 days later, Jasmine stood in her jewelry workshop, trying to return to the rhythm of normal life after the most extraordinary week of her career. Her hands moved mechanically over a silver bracelet design, muscle memory guiding the familiar motions, but her mind kept drifting to the distributed copies of herself that were still operating throughout the regional network. Federal technicians were slowly withdrawing her defensive programs as they implemented permanent security measures, but the process required careful coordination to avoid disrupting the systems that people depended on. It was strange to watch pieces of her consciousness being systematically deactivated, like losing parts of herself that had spread across an entire digital ecosystem. The bell above her door chimed, and Tom entered with an expression she'd never seen before. Something that mixed awe, gratitude, and deep respect with an undercurrent of concern for her well-being. "The final damage reports came in this morning," he said without preamble, consulting a folder of official documents. Across the 3-state region, the coordinated attack caused system failures affecting 2.3 million people over a geographic area larger than some countries. He paused, letting the scope sink in before continuing. Estimated casualties from the attack: 12 injuries related to traffic accidents and equipment malfunctions. 0 deaths. Jasmine looked up from her work, setting down the delicate tools that seemed almost childish compared to the digital weapons she'd wielded 3 days earlier. That's better than I dared to hope. Jasmine, do you understand what that means? Tom's voice carried an intensity she'd rarely heard from him. Intelligence officials are saying this should have been a catastrophic attack. Based on the scope and coordination of the assault, they were expecting hundreds of deaths, thousands of injuries, and infrastructure damage in the billions of dollars. Instead, you held the line until federal resources could respond effectively. She nodded quietly, still processing the magnitude of what had happened. The distributed defense system she'd improvised had not only protected Cedar Springs, but had evolved to defend the entire regional network, adapting and learning in ways that she was still trying to understand. Tom, I need you to know something important. The person you've known for 10 years, the quiet jewelry maker who keeps to herself and avoids attention, that wasn't the whole truth about who I am. I figured as much after watching you single-handedly fight off what amounts to a digital invasion. People don't learn to conduct cyber warfare from fixing laptops for neighbors. Over the next hour, Jasmine told him everything she'd been hiding for a decade. Her career in critical systems programming, the St. Mary's Hospital disaster that had driven her into exile, the crushing guilt that had haunted her every day since Timothy Chen's death, and her desperate attempt to find redemption through a life of deliberate simplicity and harmlessness. Tom listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful rather than shocked. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the information, but the courage it had taken for her to share it. "So you came here to hide from your mistakes," he said finally. "Yes. And you stayed here for 10 years, making beautiful things and helping your neighbors, because you thought you were too dangerous to work with critical systems again." "Yes. I was afraid that if I returned to that world, I might make another mistake that would cost lives. So I chose a path where the worst thing that could happen was a crooked setting or a tarnished finish." Tom was quiet for another moment, studying her face with the shrewd assessment of someone who'd spent decades reading character and making difficult decisions based on incomplete information. "Jasmine, do you know what I think?" "What?" "I think Cedar Springs got exactly the guardian it needed. Maybe the whole region did. Your mistakes taught you to be careful, to think about consequences, to take responsibility seriously. Those aren't weaknesses. They're exactly the qualities that made you the right person to face this crisis." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor that changed everything again. Agent Carmen Martinez stood on Jasmine's workshop doorstep, wearing civilian clothes and carrying a briefcase that suggested official business conducted away from official offices. "I come bearing gifts," Carmen said, entering without invitation with the familiarity of an old colleague. "Legal immunity from the Justice Department, a presidential commendation that you'll never be allowed to display publicly, and job offers from about 6 different federal agencies." Jasmine gestured to a chair, pouring coffee for both of them with hands that were finally steady again. The familiar ritual of hospitality helped ground her in the present moment, away from the swirling possibilities that Carmen's arrival represented. "And what do these job offers involve?" "Critical infrastructure protection, cyber warfare defense, homeland security applications. The kind of work you used to do, but with unlimited resources, official authorization to break things when necessary, and the full backing of the federal government." Jasmine sipped her coffee, looking around her workshop at the half-finished projects that represented 10 years of peaceful, creative work. The silver wire and precious stones seemed to belong to a different world than the one Carmen was describing. "I make jewelry now, Carmen. This is my life. You saved thousands of lives 3 days ago using skills that maybe 12 people in the entire world possess. The country needs those skills, especially now that we understand how vulnerable our infrastructure really is. The weight of responsibility settled on Jasmine's shoulders again, but this time it felt different. Instead of crushing guilt, it carried the possibility of redemption, not just for her past mistakes, but for the future protection of people who would never know her name. What if I make another mistake? What if I write code that fails when it matters most? Carmen leaned forward, her expression serious but understanding. Jasmine, the code you wrote for St. Mary's Hospital 10 years ago had a flaw that caused a system failure lasting 6 minutes. Yes, someone died, and that's tragic. But the code you improvised 3 days ago prevented a coordinated attack that could have killed hundreds of people and crippled an entire region's infrastructure. She paused, letting the comparison sink in. Maybe it's time to stop defining yourself by your worst day and start recognizing the incredible good you can do when you're at your best. That afternoon, Jasmine walked through Cedar Springs, observing the town that had been her refuge for a decade. The systems she'd protected were running smoothly, their operation invisible to the people who depended on them. Children played in parks where the streetlights now worked properly, and traffic flowed through intersections controlled by signals that responded correctly to actual traffic patterns. The hospital hummed with the quiet efficiency of equipment that functioned as designed, protecting patients whose lives depended on electronic systems working flawlessly. At the library, she found Mrs. Patterson organizing returned books with her characteristic attention to detail and community care. Jasmine? I heard about your heroics, though I confess I don't entirely understand what you did. I fixed some broken computers, Mrs. Patterson. That's all. That's not what Tom says. He says you saved the whole county from some kind of attack by foreign enemies. Single-handedly, according to the rumors. Jasmine smiled, appreciating the older woman's tendency to cut through complexity to reach essential truths. Tom has a tendency toward dramatics. Mrs. Patterson studied her with the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent decades managing a small-town library, a position that required equal parts diplomacy, detective work, and practical psychology. She'd watched countless people navigate personal crises and emerge changed by the experience. You know, dear, I've always suspected there was more to your story than jewelry making. Not that there's anything wrong with jewelry making, mind you. But you have the look of someone carrying heavier burdens than silver wire and gemstones typically create. What kind of look is that? The look of someone who's seen important things go wrong and blamed themselves for it. I see it sometimes in veterans who've lost friends, in doctors who've lost patients, in people who've held lives in their hands and watched them slip away despite their best efforts. Jasmine felt tears threatening for the first time in years, touched by the older woman's intuitive understanding of burdens she'd never spoken about. What if I hold lives in my hands again and something goes wrong? What if my mistakes hurt people again? Mrs. Patterson set down the book she'd been cataloging and gave Jasmine her full attention, recognizing a moment that required more than casual conversation. My dear, I've watched you work for 10 years. I've seen how carefully you handle every piece of jewelry, how precisely you shape every design, how much thought you put into creating things that will bring joy to people you may never see again. Do you know what that tells me about your character? What? It tells me that you understand the weight of responsibility better than most people ever will. The people who cause the most damage in the world are usually the ones who don't worry about causing damage. They act without thinking about consequences, make decisions without considering how they'll affect others. She smiled with the warmth of someone who'd spent decades helping people find their way through difficult decisions. The fact that you're afraid of making mistakes probably means you're exactly the person who should be trusted with important work. Your fear isn't a weakness, it's evidence that you take responsibility seriously. That evening, Jasmine sat in her workshop with Carmen's briefcase open on her workbench, the official documents inside representing a return to the world she'd fled 10 years earlier. Federal employment applications, security clearance renewals, and job descriptions that involved the kind of critical responsibility that had once driven her into exile. Next to the briefcase lay her current project, a delicate necklace commissioned for a young bride whose wedding was scheduled for the following month. The contrast between the two paths couldn't have been starker, one leading back to the high-stakes world of critical systems and national security, the other continuing the quiet, creative life she'd built in Cedar Springs. Her phone buzzed with a text from David Kim, her former colleague who'd first warned her about digital solutions. Plus, Jasmine, I don't know what you did, but the cybersecurity community is calling it legendary. Word is spreading through classified channels about someone who single-handedly prevented a regional infrastructure attack. If you ever want to come back to the field, name your price and pick your employer. Another message followed from someone she didn't recognize. Ms. Parker, this is Dr. Sarah Chen, Chief Technology Officer at Seattle General Hospital. We're redesigning our critical systems infrastructure following recent events, and we'd like to discuss bringing you on as a consultant. We understand you have experience with medical system failures and would value your insight into prevention protocols. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same expertise that had driven her from the medical technology field was now being sought specifically because of her experience with failure and the hard-won wisdom that came from it. She picked up the bride's necklace, running her fingers over the intricate silverwork that would serve as something beautiful and meaningful for one person on one special day. Then she looked at the federal documents that could potentially protect millions of people from the kind of attack she'd just prevented. Both were valuable. Both served important purposes, but only one required skills that perhaps a dozen people in the world possessed at the level necessary for national security applications. Her decision crystallized as she remembered Mrs. Patterson's words about responsibility and the weight of carrying lives in your hands. She'd spent 10 years punishing herself for one mistake, avoiding responsibility to prevent the possibility of future failures. Maybe it was time to spend the next 10 years preventing others from making similar mistakes, using her unique perspective to build better, safer systems. She opened her laptop and began typing an email to Carmen Martinez. Carmen, I accept the offer from the Infrastructure Protection Agency with conditions that are non-negotiable. First, I maintain my residence in Cedar Springs and work remotely whenever possible. This community took me in when I needed sanctuary, and I won't abandon them now that I have the resources to contribute to their security and prosperity. She paused, thinking about the distributed defense system that was still partially active throughout the regional network, quietly learning and adapting to new threats. Second, I want a small team of the best programmers we can find. People who understand that critical systems require obsessive attention to detail, redundancy, and graceful failure modes. I've learned that the most dangerous systems are those designed by people who don't believe they can fail. Third, any system I help design must include protocols for graceful failure and recovery. If something goes wrong, it should fail in the safest possible way, not the most catastrophic. I never want to see another situation where a single point of failure can cascade into widespread damage. Before sending the email, she added one final paragraph that captured the essence of what she'd learned during her decade of exile. Fourth, I want to keep making jewelry, not as a hobby, but as a reminder that technology should serve human purposes, not dominate them. Beauty, craftsmanship, and personal connection matter as much as efficiency and security. The moment we lose sight of the human element is the moment Our systems become dangerous to the people they're meant to protect. Carmen, I can't promise I won't make mistakes, but I can promise that any mistakes I make will be honest ones, and that I'll work harder than anyone to prevent the catastrophic failures that cost lives. Sometimes the people who are most afraid of failing are the ones who try hardest to succeed. 3 months later, Jasmine's workshop had been transformed into something that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. A jewelry design studio that doubled as a federal cybersecurity operations center. Multiple computer monitors displayed network security status from critical infrastructure systems across the Pacific Northwest, while her jewelry workbench remained active with ongoing projects that kept her grounded in the physical world. The arrangement worked better than she'd expected. The meditative precision required for jewelry making provided a counterbalance to the intensity of cybersecurity work, while her artistic practice informed her approach to system design in ways that purely technical training never could have achieved. She was putting the finishing touches on a custom engagement ring when her secure phone buzzed with an alert from the regional monitoring system. Someone was probing the network defenses at a major hospital in Portland. Not a full attack, but reconnaissance that could precede a more serious assault. Jasmine set down her jewelry tools with practiced efficiency and moved to the computer terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she traced the intrusion attempts and began implementing countermeasures. The distributed defense system she'd created was still learning, still evolving, and it recognized patterns in the probing that suggested coordination with similar attacks that had been attempted against other targets. Within minutes, she'd identified the source of the reconnaissance and deployed defensive measures that would make the hospital's systems invisible to further probing while alerting federal authorities to the potential threat. All clear, she reported to the regional command center. Threat neutralized. Source data forwarded to FBI Cybercrime Division for investigation. As she returned to her jewelry work, Jasmine reflected on the strange satisfaction of her dual career. During the day, she created beautiful objects that would mark important moments in people's lives. Engagement rings, anniversary gifts, graduation presents that would become family heirlooms. During the evening, she protected the digital infrastructure that kept those same people safe, healthy, and connected to the services they needed. The young woman who'd commissioned the engagement ring arrived as the afternoon sun slanted through the workshop windows, her excitement visible from across the room. "Is it ready?" she asked, practically bouncing with anticipation. Jasmine held up the finished piece, a delicate band with a small diamond surrounded by intricate silver work that caught the light like captured stars. The setting incorporated subtle geometric patterns that reflected her technical background, creating beauty from mathematical precision. "It's perfect," the woman whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "He's going to propose next week at the place where we first met. I can't believe something so beautiful came from this little town." As she watched the young woman leave with her carefully wrapped ring, Jasmine felt the deep satisfaction that came from work that served both security and beauty, protection and joy. She'd found a way to use her skills that honored both her need for redemption and her desire to create meaningful things that brought happiness to others. Her secure phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Carmen. "Jasmine, we've got intelligence suggesting another coordinated infrastructure attack is being planned for next month. Different actors, but similar methods to what you faced in Cedar Springs. We need your distributed defense protocols ready for deployment across the entire Western power grid." Jasmine smiled as she saved her jewelry designs and opened the network security interface. Some battles were worth fighting, especially when you'd learned that the measure of a person wasn't their worst mistake, but what they chose to do with their second chances. Outside her window, Cedar Springs settled into another peaceful evening, its residents safe in their homes, protected by systems they'd never see and defended by someone who'd learned that true strength came not from avoiding failure, but from refusing to let failure define you. 2 years after the Cedar Springs incident, Jasmine had established what colleagues privately called the Guardian Network, a distributed system of cybersecurity specialists working from small communities across rural America. Each specialist maintained their cover life while monitoring critical infrastructure for their region, creating an invisible web of protection that operated below the radar of both enemies and bureaucracy. The concept had emerged naturally from her own experience. Rural communities were particularly vulnerable to cyber attacks because they lacked the resources and expertise to detect sophisticated threats, but they were also ideal locations for defensive specialists who needed to work without attracting attention. Small towns provided cover, community support, and the kind of peaceful environment that allowed for the intense focus required for advanced cybersecurity work. There was Marcus Chen, a former military programmer who ran a small bookstore in Helena, Montana, while protecting the electrical grid across 3 states. His shop specialized in technical manuals and classic literature, providing perfect cover for someone who needed access to cutting-edge information while maintaining the appearance of quiet academic pursuits. Sarah Williams operated a dog grooming business in Cheyenne, Wyoming, that doubled as a command center for water treatment facility security across the Rocky Mountain region. Her clients never suspected that the woman who so carefully bathed their pets spent her evenings protecting municipal water supplies from potential contamination through cyber attacks. David Rodriguez had opened a coffee roastery in Bend, Oregon, that served as his cover for protecting transportation networks throughout the Pacific Northwest. The complex process of roasting coffee provided an excellent parallel to the patience and precision required for network security, while the steady stream of customers gave him perfect cover for the equipment and communication needs of his real work. They met quarterly in person, monthly by secure video conference, and were connected 24/7 through encrypted channels that Jasmine had designed personally. The network had prevented 17 major infrastructure attacks over 2 years, most of them so quietly that the affected populations never knew they'd been under threat. The beauty of the system was its invisibility and redundancy. Traditional cybersecurity operations were centralized, creating single points of failure that sophisticated enemies could target. The Guardian network was distributed across dozens of small communities, with each specialist capable of independent operation while contributing to collective defense of the entire region. Jasmine still made jewelry, and her pieces had gained recognition far beyond Cedar Springs. Customers traveled from hundreds of miles away to commission work from the artisan who makes each piece like it might save the world. If only they knew how literally that description sometimes applied. Her workshop had become a pilgrimage site for people seeking something unique and meaningful. Jewelry that combined technical precision with artistic vision, created by someone who understood both beauty and the hidden infrastructure that made modern life possible. The young woman whose engagement ring Jasmine had finished 2 years earlier returned to the workshop on a crisp autumn morning, now married and glowing with early pregnancy. The ring had become a family heirloom even before the family was complete, worn through a wedding that had become local legend and now carried as a symbol of love that had grown stronger through the challenges of early marriage. "I need something special," she said, settling into the familiar chair beside Jasmine's workbench with the comfort of someone who'd found a trusted artisan. "A necklace for my daughter, something she can wear her whole life, something that will keep her safe." Jasmine looked up from the computer terminal where she'd been monitoring network traffic patterns across the Western power grid, noting unusual but not threatening activity that required observation but not intervention. The request touched something deep in her understanding of protection, the desire to shield those we love from dangers they couldn't even imagine. "I think I know exactly what you need," Jasmine said, reaching for her design notebook. Something that combines strength and beauty, something that will grow more meaningful over time rather than becoming outdated or fragile. As she began sketching, her secure phone remained silent, a good sign that meant her colleagues in the Guardian network were successfully maintaining their watch across the region. Somewhere, Marcus was probably helping a customer find the perfect technical manual while his monitoring systems tracked grid stability across Montana. Sarah was likely finishing a particularly challenging grooming appointment, while her water treatment security protocols ran automated scans for unusual chemical signatures that might indicate tampering. It was, Jasmine had learned, the best kind of heroism, the kind that happened quietly, consistently, and without recognition. The kind that measured success not in accolades or advancement, but in the simple fact that people could go to sleep safely in their homes, trusting that the systems they depended on would work as promised when morning came. She finished the necklace design and showed it to her customer. A delicate silver chain supporting a small pendant shaped like a stylized network node. Its surface designed to catch and reflect light like a tiny beacon. The technical inspiration was subtle enough that most people would see only elegant geometry. But those who understood network topology would recognize the deeper meaning. "It's perfect," the young mother whispered, tracing the design with her finger. "What do you call this pattern?" Jasmine smiled, thinking of the hidden meanings woven into the piece. The technical precision that made it structurally sound, the artistic vision that made it beautiful, and the love that made it meaningful to someone who would wear it for decades. "I call it connected," she said simply, "because we're all part of something larger than ourselves, and the connections between us are what make us strong." As the satisfied customer left with her carefully wrapped purchase, Jasmine returned to her monitors, checking the quiet indicators that showed the digital world functioning as it should. Another day of protecting the invisible infrastructure that modern life depended on. Another day of creating beauty that would outlast any technology. The phone rang. Carmen's voice carried the easy familiarity of a colleague who'd become a close friend over 2 years of collaboration. "Jasmine, we've got activity on the international monitoring systems. Nothing immediate, but patterns that suggest someone is preparing for another large-scale infrastructure attack. Different methodology this time. More subtle. Longer preparation period." "How long do we have?" "Hard to say. Could be months, could be weeks. But I wanted you to know so the Guardian network can start preparing enhanced monitoring protocols." "Understood. I'll coordinate with the team tonight." After Carmen hung up, Jasmine looked around her workshop, at the jewelry projects that represented her public life, and the computer equipment that protected her community and region. 2 years ago, she'd been forced to choose between hiding from responsibility and embracing it. Now she understood that the choice hadn't been between safety and danger, but between isolation and connection. She was exactly where she belonged, at the intersection of code and craft, guardian and artist, protector of both the systems that kept people safe and the dreams that made life worth living. The network hummed on, invisible and essential, watched over by guardians who understood that the greatest battles were often fought in silence. 5 years after the Cedar Springs incident, the Guardian network had evolved into something unprecedented in the history of cybersecurity. A distributed defense system that protected rural America through the simple expedient of placing highly skilled specialists in communities where they could live normal lives while maintaining constant vigilance over critical infrastructure. The official reports would never mention their existence. Federal agencies took credit for the dramatic improvement in infrastructure security across the American West, citing enhanced monitoring protocols and upgraded defensive systems. Politicians made speeches about increased investment in cybersecurity while knowing nothing about the small-town artisans, shop owners, and service providers who actually kept the lights on and the water flowing. Jasmine preferred it that way. Recognition brought attention, attention brought scrutiny, and scrutiny interfered with the quiet work of protection that had become her life's true calling. Her jewelry business continued to thrive, with pieces finding their way into collections around the world. But the real satisfaction came from the nights when her screens showed green across all monitoring systems. Another day when the invisible network had kept its promise to protect people who would never know they'd been in danger. The workshop now housed 3 distinct but interconnected operations. The jewelry studio where she created objects of beauty that would outlast generations, the cybersecurity command center where she coordinated defensive operations across multiple states, and the training facility where new Guardian Network specialists learned to balance public lives with secret responsibilities. Her latest apprentice was a young woman named Amanda Foster, a former military cyber specialist who'd grown tired of bureaucracy and wanted to use her skills in a more direct way to protect people. Amanda was learning both jewelry making and advanced network defense, understanding that the combination wasn't coincidental. Both required patience, precision, and the ability to see how small details affected larger systems. The key to both crafts, Jasmine explained, as Amanda struggled with a particularly complex silver setting, is understanding that you're working with systems that have their own logic. Push too hard, and the metal breaks. Move too fast, and you miss the subtle signs that something is going wrong. But treat the material with respect, learn its properties, and you can create things that last forever. The lesson applied equally to network security, where the most effective defenses were often the most subtle, working within the natural flow of data traffic to identify and neutralize threats before they could cause damage. Amanda nodded, concentrating on the delicate work of setting a small sapphire in a ring that would become an engagement gift. It's harder than I expected, but I can see how the skills transfer. In both cases, you're trying to create something that's both functional and beautiful. Something that serves a purpose while bringing joy to the people who encounter it. Exactly. And in both cases, the most important work is often invisible. A perfect setting holds the stone securely, but doesn't draw attention to itself. A good defensive system stops attacks without the protected systems ever knowing they were threatened. As Amanda worked on her project, Jasmine reviewed intelligence reports from across the Guardian network. The threats were evolving, becoming more sophisticated and targeted, but so were the defenses. Each attack that was successfully prevented provided data that improved the collective security of the entire network. Her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Marcus in Montana. Unusual traffic patterns detected across the western power grid. Looks like reconnaissance for a coordinated attack, possibly within the next 72 hours. Recommend activation of enhanced monitoring protocols. Similar reports came in from other nodes in the network over the following hours. Sarah in Wyoming detected anomalous queries against water treatment databases. David in Oregon noticed subtle attempts to map transportation control systems. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone was preparing for another major infrastructure attack. But this time, they were ready. The Guardian network activated seamlessly, each specialist taking responsibility for their assigned systems while coordinating through the encrypted communication channels Jasmine had designed. Unlike 5 years earlier, when she'd fought alone against overwhelming odds, this battle would be fought by dozens of skilled defenders working in perfect coordination. The attack, when it came, was sophisticated beyond anything they'd previously encountered. The adversaries had learned from the failure of the Cedar Springs operation, implementing more subtle infiltration methods and distributed command structures that were harder to detect and disrupt. But they hadn't counted on the evolution of the defensive systems they were attacking. The Guardian Network had spent 5 years learning, adapting, and preparing for exactly this kind of assault. Where the attackers expected to find vulnerable rural infrastructure protected by outdated security measures, they instead encountered defenses that seemed to anticipate every move and counter every strategy with responses that adapted in real time to changing threats. The battle lasted 18 hours and was fought entirely in the digital realm, invisible to the millions of people whose lives depended on its outcome. When it was over, the attackers had been not only repelled, but systematically traced back to their origins, providing intelligence that would prevent similar attacks for years to come. The only visible sign of the conflict was a brief news report about routine maintenance that had temporarily affected some internet services across the western United States. Life continued normally for the vast majority of people, who never suspected that they'd been protected by a network of guardians they'd never heard of, working from small towns they'd never visited. In her workshop in Cedar Springs, Jasmine returned to her jewelry making with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd helped save thousands of lives without anyone knowing her name. She picked up the silver wire and began shaping it into patterns that would become beautiful objects, her hands steady and her mind at peace. Amanda looked up from her own work, a perfect sapphire setting that gleamed in the afternoon light. Is it always like that? The threats just appear and disappear without anyone noticing? The best protection is invisible, Jasmine replied, her fingers working silver wire into intricate patterns that somehow echoed the logical flow of network architecture. When you do the job perfectly, it looks like nothing happened at all. She held up her newest creation, a pendant that combined technical precision with artistic vision, beautiful enough to be treasured for generations while incorporating subtle design elements that reflected the hidden digital infrastructure that made modern life possible. The people who wear our jewelry will never know that the same hands that shaped these pieces also shaped the defenses that keep them safe. And that's exactly as it should be. Outside the workshop windows, Cedar Springs settled into another peaceful evening. Streetlights came on at exactly the right time. Traffic signals coordinated the smooth flow of vehicles. Hospital equipment hummed with reliable precision, and emergency services maintained their constant readiness to respond to whatever challenges might arise. The Guardian Network maintained its silent watch, invisible protectors serving communities that had become their families, using skills developed in the crucible of crisis to ensure that such crises would never again catch them unprepared. In her notebook, Jasmine wrote a final entry. The best defense is the one no one sees. The best code is the kind that works so smoothly that people forget it exists. The best jewelry makes someone feel beautiful when they wear it. All three serve the same purpose. They protect what matters most, the ability of people to live, love, and pursue happiness without fear of the invisible dangers that surround them. She closed the notebook and returned to her work, fingers steady, code secure, community protected. The network hummed on, invisible and essential, watched over by guardians who understood that the greatest victories were measured not in recognition, but in the simple continuation of ordinary life. The ghost in the machine had found her true calling, standing guard at the intersection of human vulnerability and technological power, ensuring that the digital systems people depended on served them faithfully, and that the beauty of individual lives was never sacrificed to the cold efficiency of the network. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats to assess and counter, new jewelry to create, and new people to protect. But tonight, all was well in Cedar Springs and throughout the region that had become her responsibility. The Guardian Network was online. The defenses were holding, And somewhere in the darkness, invisible protectors maintained their eternal vigil over the lights that kept civilization running. The code that had once failed spectacularly had evolved into something that never failed at all. Not because it was perfect, but because it was designed by people who understood the true cost of failure and were determined never to pay that price again. In the end, Jasmine Parker had become exactly what the world needed. Not a hero seeking glory, but a guardian seeking only the quiet satisfaction of work done well and people kept safe. The network of trust she'd built would outlast any individual member, protecting communities and regions with the dedicated invisibility that represented the highest form of service. The code lived on, embedded in systems that grew stronger with each passing day, defended by people who understood that the greatest gift they could give was the one that would never be recognized: the gift of safety, security, and the freedom to live without fear of the digital darkness that might otherwise consume everything they held dear. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most, and where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.